Good morning. This is Jason Dean coming live at you again for another Film Fanatic show. Hope everyone's doing good. So yeah, it is 9:02 on a Thursday morning, November 13th. Here we go. So yeah, I guess for things that are coming up for me, I guess I have a show I'm really looking forward to, which is going to be tomorrow with Osmia. Which is I started playing with Osmia in December. Well, actually, it's a little bit of a blur as to when I actually started playing with them. But we did a tour in I think it was in April of this year, and then I started playing with them, and then it was it was an interesting kind of thing of a chain of events. Osmia is a band that's been around for quite a few years. They and so I I got to see them play once in Belfast. I think it was at a like this little house party, or it was like a little music festival. I think it was called Bob Fest, and I saw them play there once. This is a few years ago now, and then I got to see them play about three or four other times, and I really loved their sound. I saw them play a few times at Hey Sailor. I saw them play a few other, I saw them playing at this music festival, Bob Fest, I think it was called. And then and then I saw them play a handful of other times. And first time I heard them, I just totally fell in love with their music. It's real noisy, it's very atmospheric, high energy, definitely punk inspired, really shoegazy, if you will, really dynamic. And so I just really fell in love with their sound. And then fast forward a few years after seeing them, I had gotten a chance to play. My band Quantum played a show with them, and it was you know really fun and getting to know those guys more. And then fast forward, I think later that summer, which was um, wasn't this past summer, it was the summer before, so it was over a year ago, which is crazy. That summer, I had gone to a music festival in Rockland. It wasn't this past summer, the summer before, and there was this big music festival at the Lincoln Street Center School. They had a bunch of vendors, and then they had a whole bunch of bands. And I remember going there, and I went there pretty much by myself. But then I ran into Leo, who is the singer and principal writer for Osmia. It's basically his baby, and so I ran into him there, and then we ended up getting some beers and hung out for hours. And the festival was like an all day thing, so we ended up hanging out all day, had a really great time, saw some really great music, and then a couple times after that, he came out to a couple of Quantum shows, and I remember our last album, which was, it's crazy how time just goes by. Exactly, just about a year ago now, we released our last studio album, In Dreams I Saw Chapter Two, and we had a our release show at Hey Sailor, and he came to that, and he had come out to a couple other shows, and so I remember after that we talked about just getting together and having beers, just getting together and hanging, and maybe jamming. And so fast forward a couple more weeks or months after that, he Leo came over, and we just started. We got some beers, and we just hung out and jammed and talked about music, and we just had a little jam session, and it was super fun because again, I've been a big fan of their music for a long time. So, and then I think in the midst of that, their drummer that they had, whose name was who his name is Jason, also had just kind of decided to quit the band. They had, as a band, Osmond, they had plans to kind of go out on the road more and to do some touring and kind of expand a little bit with like where they were playing, because at that time they were playing mainly in Mid Coast Maine. They were playing a lot at Hey Sailor. They were playing down in Portland a little bit, but they wanted to do a tour and kind of reach out a little bit more. And their drummer Jason had no real interest in that. So in the midst of us kind of getting together and just kind of jamming for shits and giggles, he quit. And then after a couple of weeks, that led to maybe where I was asked if I'd be interested in playing some shows, and I was like, yeah, hell yeah, because I was a huge I'm a huge fan of their music. They were one of my favorite rock bands around, and it's a style I love. When it comes to rock, and so I said yeah, and then that was kind of on the table for a little bit, and at first, and they were also booking a tour during this time, and at one point they were going to do it. Leo and Eric is also the he plays guitar and plays bass and does a lot of cool creative things. So they were thinking of just doing the tour anyway, but as a duo. And so it was kind of up in the air as far as what was going to happen, if I was going to play with them or and what have you. And it was funny because Leo had told me afterwards that he liked my drumming. I guess he had seen me play, I don't know, in a few other bands or and what have you over the years, which I wasn't aware because I had only knew of him coming out to a couple of Quantum shows, but he had said something that he had heard me play a few times and thought I was pretty good, but he didn't think I was a heavy of a hitter. He thought I wouldn't be able to like fill up the sound because their music is at times very very heavy, and he thought I was like just kind of a nice quiet drummer, and because a lot of the bands that I was playing with at that time, and even to a degree a little bit of some of the bands I play with now, most of the bands are kind of mellow and kind of quiet. So that was kind of funny. So he didn't think I would be really the right fit because I was not a real heavy drummer. Jason Hay, their previous drummer, was a real heavy hitter. And I said to Leo, I used to play a lot of that kind of music, but just how things have been, I just don't. And typically, most of the things I do now are pretty sedate or pretty mellow. So, and then we ended up having a jam, all three of us, more or less an audition, and it seemed like it clicked. And then they asked me about being a regular member, and then suddenly I was in the band. And then a few days or a couple weeks later, I agreed to do this big tour, and then we did this big tour, and then ever since then it's been such a blast. And we just finished last night. We just finished tracking our an album we've been working on. We started working on it about probably we started working on it in October, and we worked on it for a while, and then we had to take a break because various other things and people's schedules and things, and we weren't able to do any recording for a while. But then we got back at it, and we finished it seems like we finished the main tracking of the album last night. So really excited. But tomorrow night we're going to be playing. Osmond's going to be playing with this really incredible band called Cushing, which is the best band I've ever seen at Hey Sailor. They are just a juggernaut of a band. They really remind me of early Swans, which is one of the Swans, like the early stuff that they did in the 70s and 80s, is some of my favorite kind of punk music, and they really reminded me of that. And they're very atmospheric, very dark. So anyway, we're going to be playing with them along with Gunshot Glitter and a couple other groups tomorrow at Hey Sailor. So if you're around at 7 o'clock, come on by. So yeah, and then we have another Quantum show coming up after that. So Travis Lloyd, who is a local music legend, tremendously talented guy. He had the Travis Lloyd Band for a very long time. He also has a side project, an electronic group that is just incredible, and we're going to be playing together at Hey Sailor in December. So there'll be a bunch of promotion for that coming up. So yeah. So anyway, I've been doing music shows here at Film Fanatic headquarters. Kind of wanted to get into. I mean, music. Doing music videos is not anything new for this channel. But I've been kind of taking a step back and thinking about music that really, in particular, styles of music that I just really am excited about, and and for what it's worth, music that really, really inspires me personally, but especially inspires me with my band Quantum, as far as like styles that really influence that band. I've always said too, the main thing that inspires uh, what I do with my weird little band Quantum, the main inspiration is film. And I've said that many times, but I really, I had originally tried. I threw my hat in the ring of making films, and I have some experience making um, in that world where I at one point I had done these little music videos for a band I used to be in, and then I also made a short little horror film, and all of those things. And I was really wanting to pursue more of that career. But it was interesting because fast forward, 10 years after that, I ended up founding my band Quantum. And I was able to put all of those things, my love of film, and then my love for film just kept increasing since I had worked on those projects. I formed my band Quantum, and suddenly I was able to put that energy in this kind of weird way, but taking that same energy of something I wanted to pursue, and putting it in my band Quantum. Because that's why we're, the soundtrack vibe, um, the theatrical presentation that we try to do, all those things I kind of put into those energies. So into the band, so that like totally satisfies that part of my brain. So that's kind of what I do instead. And it's kind of a weird, combination of things. But and through that, I've been kind of like thinking lately of like groups, outside of film being the biggest inspiration for the band. Obvious, there's a ton of music that is that's a massive influence. So I kind of was thinking about, and then just music I just love anyway. So I was thinking of like, I should cover that. I should talk about some music that is very much part of my, that makes my weird brain the way it is. And I just did a show on my love of drum and bass and jungle music, and that's going to be uploaded here any minute. And I've talked a lot. I've done a lot of shows lately on Altecker, which is my favorite band of all time. Massive when it comes to music, definitely the biggest influence for me, especially electronic music. And then I'm also really influenced with by a lot of jazz. I'm really influenced by a lot of jazz music. I love jazz to death. I listen to a lot of jazz, especially Miles Davis, the Miles Davis Quintet. That's my favorite jazz group of all time. I'm really influenced by that music, and I'm really influenced by a lot of '70s funk, Herbie Hancock and Headhunters. And then I'm also really influenced by a lot of reggae music. By metal. I'm really influenced by a lot of punk and then even black metal. And I did a big show a while ago on house music, massive influence on me, and deep love with all of that. Did a big show on Anthony Papa, who is my favorite house music DJ of all time, and I got a chance to see him this year, and that was just absolutely awesome. So a lot of different influences, and I like and hip hop. I'm gonna probably do a show on hip hop and rap because I'm a huge fan of that style as well. So it's I try to be open, and in particular, I mean, because the band Quantum is definitely like I mean, I like to think it has a lot of different influences, but it's safe to say it's an electronic group. But what I try to do, and I think sometimes it maybe people can hear it, but maybe they don't, and that's fine. But I like to take ideas from music that is not necessarily electronic music and try to apply it into this style that I try to do. You know, and I think a lot of that comes from a lot of time, a lot of time being invested in listening to jazz because I really think about melody and and harmony to a degree and the dynamics of what music can do. And so I try to bring a lot of those elements. I try to bring a lot of other non electronic music elements to the band to kind of like give it a richness, and that's subjective, whatever it is. But I try to do that to give it a different, a different spin on things. Because I do think sometimes that happens, and it's very much a normal thing, and I've done it too, where you might just really in that whatever particular style you're writing in, you might just kind of be absorbing and listening to music in that particular style, other artists. But I've always believed that that's great and that's a natural thing. But I always feel like it's also, I think, pretty cool, and it kind of can expand things if you listen to stuff that is outside of that style, and maybe that will like maybe consciously or subconsciously, maybe it won't, but there's that chance that that can seep into the sound and give it a different tone or something. So, and today's show is on one of my favorite styles of music, which is a really, really big part of what we do with Quantum, and that is ambient music. So I wanted to do a show where I wanted to talk about my history of getting into this music, some of the records, some of the albums that I just really, really love, albums that I always go back to, and kind of the really unique style that ambient music is. Because I think it's really tricky, and that sounds a little funny, but I think it's really tricky to compose ambient music. So I wanted to talk about all those things, all things ambient today. So yeah, like I said, outside and then definitely inside, but outside of just being a big music fan, and especially when it comes to electronic music, because I definitely feel ambient music is electronic music. I had mentioned yesterday in the show that's coming up today on the channel that I'm upload. I did a big show on drum and bass and jungle music, and I kind of how I got into it, how it's changed, uh, you know, how it's changed for me over the years, how it really greatly influences or has been a big influence for me, and all those things. But the world the word or the genre of electronic music is massive, and so I think all of these little subsets, the, the, the jungle stuff, the ambient music, um, and I even think to a degree hip hop, some hip hop out there and some rap music is part of that world too. House music, obviously, trap music, dubstep, all kinds of stuff, noise, um, are all kind of these little subsets or little subgenres of what electronic music can be or is. And I very much feel like ambient music is a big part of it. And just for my own habits, and just being a big fan of music, it's a real it's definitely one of my favorite styles. And then also, and getting back to quantum, like it is a major major influence on what we do. We do have quite a few pieces that are more or less straight up ambient music. And when I said ambient music is really tricky, and I think it's really hard to get right. I mean, any style, I think from a compositional perspective, writing good music is hard as fuck. You gotta. I think if you establish a melody, when I used to write music, I used to think in terms of trying to establish. I might be like like for example, I might have come up in the practice space with like a drum groove that I thought was kind of cool, or I'm messing with a drum machine and I come up with this little rhythm and I'm like, oh, that's cool, or that's catching my attention, and then I'll use that as a start and then build off of it. But it wasn't until years later where I was definitely hitting this block and I wasn't able to really get past. I had reached my limitations, so I really had to change what I was doing. And my really great friend Mike Whitehead, who plays bass in Quantum, who comes from the jazz world, primarily a jazz trumpet player, had suggested, well, and I think it's really a jazz perspective. He felt for him writing music, melody was key. Like melody is your starting point. If you can get a good, solid base of a melody, and it's strong, you can do anything as far as compositionally. Like you can take it in so many different genres. You can take it into different genres, but you can take it in so many different directions. And it took me a long time to kind of grasp that and understand that. But then that's what I ended up doing. And then since then, the process, it still takes me forever to do, but it started to make sense. So that's what I did. And I take that as, that was one of the greatest things that I learned about over the years. It was a real eye opener. And it took me a long time to kind of understand that. And it doesn't speed up the process for me, but it's a real, and I really take that as a thing coming from the jazz world. And that's one of the reasons I love listening to jazz so much. And I try to study jazz because it's a language. And I try to apply, you know, whether I'm successful or not is, most of the time I don't think I am, but I try. And so I try to take those sensibilities, those aesthetics from the jazz world, and really try to apply it to writing and to just writing music in general. So, yeah. And I think ambient music has this funny thing because I think ambient music, it's really composed of, some of these albums and records I'm going to talk about today. Ambient music is, well, essentially, it creates a mood, it's very atmospheric. You have ambient music that has a very spooky or dark quality. And then you have music that is very, very soothing. Obviously, when I think of ambient music, I think of kind of, some music that puts you in a meditative state, calms you, relaxes you, soothes you, all of those things. And within that it can create many many different moods. But I think with albums that I really love, artists that I really love that compose ambient music, the thing that's so tough about it is that a lot of these great records and artists that have done this music, it's truly the art of less is more. When you listen to some of this music that I'm going to talk about, there is there's definitely harmony. There's definitely a strong melody most of the time, but there is such a sparse use of notes. Usually ambient music is very minimal, total minimalist music. Sometimes there'll be only maybe three notes in a tune, but it will just be played in the right way. And a lot of it, like with music in general, it's all about the space in the music. Like sometimes the space in between the notes is, can be more powerful than the actual notes. And so, and that, I think when that is done well, where you're given a pretty limited palette or color palette, if you will, but if you can connect those dots, that space is usually, I think, what will put that person in that trance, if you will, or in that meditative state. And it's a real art form to do, because I think sometimes with ambient music, it can go into the direction of where it sounds kind of corny or a little bit too um, new agey, if you will. Like there's that thing of where sometimes I think of it in terms of like there's if you're trying to create ambient music, it can be music that is connecting and registers with you or registers with people, and it puts you in a meditative, quiet place. But then it can also bridge. It can also go into the place of where it sounds very, very, I don't know, kind of cheesy. Like it can be music that could be just thrown onto some kind of weird Spotify or Pandora playlist of like, oh, the new age music, and it's music that will be played in the background as you're getting a massage, and it doesn't have any real engagement to where you're going to actually listen to it, as opposed to just have it in the background while you're getting your back rubbed, if that makes any sense. So there's that fine line, I think, with ambient music to where it can sound a little bit silly, and maybe contrived, but just you know a little too woo. And then there's other ambient music that totes that line, but yet it's something that you can listen to and really engage with it. And it's an interesting balance. And some of my favorite artists, obviously, one of the greatest, probably the greatest pound for pound is Brian Eno. I mean, just incredible. One of my favorite artists. I've been a huge fan of Brian Eno for so long. Such a versatile artist. There's a few albums of his that I really want to talk about. Two albums of his that I think are my favorite records that he's ever done. I mean, again, there's so many albums, but Music for Airports, of course, I think is one of the most beautiful ambient albums ever done. It's probably, I mean, overall, it's such a classic, and a lot of people do talk about Music for Airports as being probably the greatest album he's done or the greatest ambient album ever recorded, and it really is. I mean, it really is such an incredible album, and I've listened to that album so many other times. I think my favorite music of his though is there was an incredible documentary that came out quite a few years ago called For All of Mankind, and it's about the lunar landings, and he composed the music for that, and that music is some of the most emotional and some of the most engaging music I've ever heard in my life. And I think that music, he did the soundtrack for the entire film, which is one of my favorite documentaries, For All of Mankind. I think that music that he composed for that film is probably my favorite thing that he's ever done. And again, there's so many things in his catalog that are just incredible. Even Roxy Music, massive fan. But when it comes to ambient music, I really feel like he's kind of like the Godfather in some ways. And another group that I think is tremendously influential and one of the most important groups in the world of ambient music is Tangerine Dream. Massive fan of them. I have a few of their albums, and it's funny because recently I've always liked their music, but it wasn't until about 3 or 4 years ago where I just randomly saw this interview with the guitar player for I can't remember his name, the guitar player from Porcupine Tree, which is a prog rock band that I actually really like a lot. This guitar player was on Rick Beato, famous YouTube channel. And Rick Beato was talking to him about his favorite. Asked him basically what his favorite album of all time is, and he named Tangerine Dream's Zeist album. It's a double album that came out in the early '70s. I've always loved Tangerine Dream, but the way he talked about this album, I was like, wow, I gotta get it. So I ended up ordering it shortly after, and it's a double disc album and it is absolutely incredible. It's definitely one of my island albums that I would have, and I think it's one of the most atmospheric ambient records I've ever heard. It's one of my favorite ambient albums, and I've listened. And I after buying the album, I bought it on CD. I've just like I've listened to it so many times, like I never get sick of it. Tangerine Dream's Iced. It's just an amazing collection. Some of the most incredible ambient music ever made. And obviously with movies, there's a lot of music that is used in films that has that quality, which is a big influence. Um, so, and then I would say when I got into that album, that was that the Tangerine Dreams Zeiss album, that was like next level. Um, and then also Aphex Twin, Aphex Twin's double album, which is also another double album, Ambient Works Part Two. I have to say that album is my all-time favorite ambient album. That album is absolutely, it's a double album. It is absolutely a transcending experience. I got into Aphex Twin. My favorite Aphex Twin album of all time is Drux, and I've talked about this album. I know I did a show on this a while ago, and I definitely mentioned that album in the previous show I just recorded about jungle and drum and bass. Just that's my favorite like full on Aphex Twin studio album. But Aphex Twin has a very experimental side to his personality, to his musical personality, and he put out Ambient Works, and his music is very much inspired by ambient music. So I remember it was like, I don't know, a long time ago. I was in college when I got into Aphex Twin, so I've been listening to him for a long time. And I remember getting, it was around the time I got into Drux, because I started buying. I fell so hard into that album that I started buying anything and everything that he had his name on. And so I bought like pretty much all of his studio albums within that year, and one of those was the Ambient Works collection, and it's a double disc album, totally um, minimalist ambient music. And to me, I have to say that is, when it comes to ambient music, that's my favorite album of all time. There's so many moods. There's music on there that is so haunting, so melancholy, so rich and beautiful. And then there's some tracks on that album that are just really kind of like terrifying and kind of ominous. And it emotionally, it runs the gamut. From melancholy, feeling peaceful, giving you this feeling of being really like being in this like soothing warm bath, and then other moments of where it's like it sounds like it's a horror movie soundtrack. Like, it runs the gamut, and it's a double disc album. And um, that album, it still is, but that album became a big obsession of mine. It's also featured in this really great documentary called The Weather Underground. They use some of the tracks from that, and it really fits the whole vibe and the whole mood perfectly well. But yeah, Aphex Twin, Ambient Works Part 2. If you've never heard that album, you got to check it out. It's just absolutely incredible. I think it's a masterpiece, and it's definitely, Drux is so heavy and brutal and just dark and fucked up and just super intense. And in ambient, in the ambient world, he did this collection, which is like so opposite and so different, but absolutely incredible. Those are my two favorite Aphex Twin albums, Drux and an Ambient Works Part 2 by far. And they're both so different. And, when it comes to the world of ambient music, definitely my favorite album of all time, hands down. And then I have to mention another artist that I very, very rarely ever talk about, and that is this little band called Autechre. Massive, massive influence on me. Again, they are, when it comes to Quantum, that definitely musically the biggest influence for me. And they have such a an eclectic sound. Like they just have such a wide range of elements in their music. They have, I think they have a big kind of hip hop influence. I think they have a big drum and bass jungle influence. Um, they started out kind of playing all of these warehouse raves in London, so they have that rave kind of vibe in their music. The old school 80s, 90s sound that came out of London at that time. They also have a very noisy, like a harsh noise vibe to their music. And I think one of their biggest things that they have in their music is uh, is their ambient side. They have a lot of their music is very dense, very intense, and kind of going for the jugular. But they also have certain tunes and certain records of where it's incredibly stripped down and really minimalist. And their ambient stuff, I think, is absolutely incredible. My favorite Autechre studio album, and I did a show on it, is Tre Repeti, which was an album that came out many many years ago, and which is probably my favorite studio album of theirs. But there's a bonus disc on that album that is comprised of a few other tunes that weren't on the album, I guess officially, but there's a few ambient pieces on that album that are just totally straight up ambient that I think are some of the most jaw-dropping music, some of the most jaw-dropping music I've ever heard, and it's all minimalist, all pure ambient music, and they've always had that quality. They even have that quality in their very drum heavy music. They're even some of their music that is very very aggressive. But I've always felt that they have this ambient side, and in Signs, which was an album that came out during COVID, is an incredible album, and there's some real minimalist ambient stuff on there, which I think it's one of their best albums as well. And those were their last like studio albums. So yeah, I look at the world of ambient music as being really really important. I think it's really it's good for the psyche. I think it's good because of the meditative state it can put you in, in times of trauma. And I wanted to do a show where I wanted to talk about my favorite albums in the style. It's one of my favorite styles, and again, I think it's one of the hardest styles to like actually get right. Um, so yeah, it's any of these records I highly recommend. I'll go through them again. Obviously, Brian Eno, so many great records to his credit. Roxy Music, massive fan. But for me, definitely Music for Airports. That album's very, very popular. Most people have heard it, but that album is just a masterpiece. And then I think an album that is more obscure and a lot of people don't know about it, but it's my favorite Brian Eno music, and that is the music for that he composed for. Now I'm drawing a blank. Brian Eno's the music my favorite Brian Eno music, For All of Mankind. It's the movie. It's a documentary that came out about some of the lunar landings, all new footage that we've never seen before. For All of Mankind, he did the soundtrack for that documentary, which I think is one of my favorite documentaries of all time. And it's the for me and for my money, it's the greatest music that he's ever composed. Tangerine Dream, Zeist. It's a double album from the early '70s. Absolutely mind blowing and totally stripped down ambient music. Very psychedelic sounding too. It's got this very psychedelic vibe. It kind of reminds me a lot of Pink Floyd live at Pompeii, minus the big rock guitars. That's like a way I can, it's got a spooky quality. It's kind of dark and but very psychedelic. There's a lot of psychedelia in the music, but then it's also very soothing too. Um, that's my favorite Tangerine Dream album, and that's one of my favorite albums of all time in this style. And then, of course, Aphex Twin, um, Ambient Works Part Two, amazing, amazing masterpiece. And Autechre, Tri especially, um, the bonus disc especially, but Signs I think is really great. But so all of this music that I've talked about is all music that I really, really recommend if you love this style. It's yeah, it's a big influence on me personally, but it is something I really try to do at times in my band Quantum. So thanks again, and we will see you next time. Peace.